Well, I'm seeing a full screen of people, and I like to start our meetings as close to on time as possible. So I think we should get going. Judy or Cece, would one of you like to introduce our speaker?
Um, I can, Cece, unless you would like to.
Oh,
Well, it's our privilege, great privilege, to have Darra Goldstein here, who will be speaking to us about the Kingdom of Rye, Russian food and national identity. Now, Darra Goldstein is a very prolific, creative, and interesting author for us to have the opportunity to listen to. I'm really excited about this. Um, she is a professor of Russian. She is a professor of Russian Emeritus at Williams College and the founding editor of Gastronomica and editor-in-chief of the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Food Studies. So she comes to us with a really deep background on culinary history. And she's working on some very interesting other books that at the end she'll be able to talk to us about. This particular talk explores Russian food and national identity from the earliest times to the present. And, Russian food is fascinating. Chow, a few years ago, we went to an interesting restaurant for our in-person annual luncheon called Russ Ooze and had an opportunity to taste food from that part of the world. So I'm really interested in hearing what she has to say as we celebrate the beauty of Russian culinary practices while acknowledging the food's inevitable role in politics. So I don't want to really say more, but I want to hand this over to Darra.
thank you so much, Judith. And thank you, Judith and Cece and Bruce, for inviting me to talk today. I don't get too much of a chance to talk about things Russian these days, understandably, because of the politics. But I hope that through this talk, we'll have a chance to celebrate what is good about Russian culture and not just all the contemporary negatives. And before I start, I'm just really curious about Rus Uz because I thought I knew all Russian. This must be Russian and Uzbek.
Yes.
And is it in DC or
It's
where?
in Arlington is where I believe we were. Yeah.
Oh, in Arlington.
It's a
Okay.
little modest restaurant, and we just had a great time there. I thought the food was interesting and delicious.
It will go on my list. Thank you
Okay,
so
good.
much for that
We'll be
tip.
happy to join you there when you come to town.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen. And um, are you all seeing this now?
Yes. Yes.
Good. Okay, this is the cover slide. And I used this slide on the cover of my book, The Kingdom of Rye, A Brief History of Russian Food, because to me it captured so much of what Russian culture and cuisine are about. Here are women, peasants, working in the field, and they've stopped the harvest of rye to have their lunch of rye bread. And I just want you to notice how they're cutting the bread. If you think when we have a loaf of bread and say it's a round loaf from the baker, and we put it on the cutting board and we cut it vertically, the Russians historically and traditionally have always held it in their arms and cut it towards the heart. And that to me really signifies what Russian bread, particularly Russian sourdough rye, means. It's sustenance, but it is also sacrament. So when we talk about food and national identity, it's an easy way to talk about food to divide it into national cuisines. But any of you who have traveled know that that's not quite so simple because all of these nations, the boundaries are political, they're not always natural. And every country is made up of regional cuisines, which are extraordinarily distinct from one another. So in a way, instead of talking about national cuisines, it makes more sense to talk about these symbolic and evocative foods that contribute to a sense of national identity, that bring people in different parts of the country together to say, yes, this is our food. And when we're talking about Russia, the first thing that we have to contemplate is how huge it is. And this isn't even as big as it was during Soviet times. If you look at all of these other colored countries in here, they all, not Mongolia, but all these others were part of the Soviet Union, which consisted of 1/6 of the entire world's landmass. Russia itself has a very difficult climate, although that's changing with climate change, especially in the Arctic, where the ice cap, I'm sorry, is melting so quickly. But it's meant that Russia has always sought to find good, arable, fertile land. And this, over the centuries, has driven its imperialistic instincts. Beginning in the 8th century, the late 8th century, the Vikings, who were known as Varangians, came down from Sweden through the Baltic Sea. And there are all these waterways which aren't depicted on this map, but they came all the way down through what is now Ukraine to the Black Sea and then Constantinople, today's Istanbul. You don't see it, it's further to the west. But there were tremendous waterways, and the early Russian tribes established a capital here in Kiev, which, as you know, is now part of the imperial aspiration of Putin's Russia. Ukraine has what is known as Chernozem, which is an extremely rich, fertile soil, probably the most fertile soil in the world. And one of the great tragedies of this war is that the farmland, the fields, have been filled with mines. They've been polluted by all kinds of munitions. And what has been a historical breadbasket for this entire region hasn't been entirely destroyed, but largely. In 1995, in Moscow, this monument was built. And the words you see here, this is in Cyrillic, it says Rus, R-U-S, apostrophe. And that is the old word for the Russian kingdom, which was established in present-day Kiev. So contemporary Russian political thought is that there is a continuum from Kievan times, which were, say, beginning in the 9th and 10th century, up to the present. And here you see a hero. I'm sorry, this keeps jumping ahead. A hero from Kievan times called a bogatyr. I'm not going to use my cursor because that seems to make the slides jump. Next to him to the right is a soldier from the Napoleonic Wars. The Russians famously defeated Napoleon in 1812. And then to his right is a Red Army soldier from World War II, in Russia known as the Great Patriotic War. And the idea is that there's a continuum and that Russia has the right to claim Kiev as part of Rus. So when I taught Russian culture and cuisine to my students, I would always ask them, what are, the most typical Russian foods? And the first thing they would always say is borscht, which is beet soup, and potatoes. And to me, that is, really interesting because perhaps that is what comes first to mind. But neither of those foods is intrinsically Russian. As we will see, borscht is originally Ukrainian. It's become a political issue. The word borscht comes from Bolshevik, which is the name of what we know as cow parsley. And I don't know if any of you have spent time in New England, but here it grows wild in the fields. It's very leafy. And originally the greens were used to make the soup. It was only in the 16th century that the bulbous beet as we know it started to be cultivated. It was developed by botanists and horticulturists, and that's when beetroot soup as we know it came into becoming this iconic soup. Potatoes were not planted in Eastern Europe until really the late 19th century, which is astonishingly late. Peter the Great, who ruled in Russia in the late 17th, early 18th century, was a huge westernizer. And he spent time in the Netherlands and had some potatoes sent back to Russia from the Netherlands. But the peasants were terrified of the potato. They did not want to plant them. Potatoes grow underground and they have eyes. And so therefore they had to be the devil's fruit. And they actually staged mutinies, rebellions. They would not plant the potato. Catherine the Great tried, they all tried. And it was only after 1840 that through a kind of soft diplomacy did they get the peasants to finally start planting them. And then the potato did indeed become a fixture in Russian life. But if you're talking about the most quintessential Russian foods, the ones that are close to the heart, it would be cabbage soup and buckwheat porridge. And in Russian, it rhymes. I'll say it too, because it's also very sibilant. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to help to teach students the language. Shchida kasha, pisha nasha. So you have all these SH sounds. You probably recognize the word kasha, which in Russian actually just means porridge of any kind. But in the United States has come to mean specifically buckwheat kasha. The other thing I want to point out here is the word pishcha, which is the second to last word in the Cyrillic. There are two words for food in Russian. The most basic word is yeda, which comes from a verb that means to be. So it's very much tied up with, that which you subsist on. You wouldn't exist if you didn't eat. So yeda is just food in general, and it can also mean a meal. But there's this other word, pishcha, which can be used in a metaphorical sense. So something perhaps a little bit loftier, like food for the soul or food of the gods. And the other aspect of its meaning is that it means real food. So for instance, if you have, for a Russian, sourdough rye bread, that is pishcha. If you have white French bread, that isn't. That's just yeda. That's just something to eat, but it's not real food. Of course, that's changing a bit these days. Another very important root in Russian cuisine is the turnip, repka. And it is still very much communicated to children about Russian culture through fairy tales and folk tales. One of the most important being the one on the left, which is simply called The Turnip. And it's about helping other people because grandpa comes out, this turnip grew so big and he pulls and he pulls and he can't get out of the ground. So then grandma comes out with him, she grabs his waist and she can't get it. The whole family comes out, then the dog and the cat, and then the neighbors, and everyone's pulling, and finally they get the turnip out of the ground. So it's teaching about a basic food, but also about community values. The other one that I really love is about this wily peasant who plants turnips, and he offers the bear half the harvest. So the bear gets the turnip tops and eats them all up, and they're very bitter. And only then does he realize that the real value is in the root. So the bear says to the peasant, okay, next year, whatever you plant, I get the root and you get the tops. And so the next year, the peasant plants rye, and the bear gets the roots of the rye, and the peasant gets the grain. So that's how they learn about turnips. So rye is a grain like buckwheat that will thrive in very cold climates. It started out probably in Central Asia and the Caucasus, around there, and just as a weed growing in the fields. But then people noticed that it was thriving where crops like wheat were not in the cold weather. So they started working with it, saving really good seeds, and making it more and more valuable as a crop. And it's also a really important grain because it has a lot of B vitamins. And its starches also convert to sugars a lot less quickly than those in wheat. And so it remains filling for a lot longer. And it's used in so many different ways. Whoops. One of the ways that Russians historically have said to live from hand to mouth is to live from bread to kvass. And I don't know how many of you have tasted kvass. It's like a very lightly alcoholic beer that is made from bread as opposed to, malted barley. But basically, the Russian bread is a sourdough rye that has been lacto fermented. And the peasants, or I should say the serfs, before they were liberated in 1861, they weren't living on much more than rye bread and lacto fermented cucumbers, which, were turned into pickles. And they had a very meager diet. But it was all that lacto fermentation, which we understand today is filled with probiotics, that enabled them to be at least somewhat healthy. So to make kvass, you take stale bread because it's very important not to waste anything, certainly not bread, which is so sacred. And you let it sit overnight in water. You soak it in quite a bit of water, and it starts to ferment. And then you pour the water off, you squeeze the bread to get the last bit of bread flavor from it. And to that water, you add a little bit of honey. You can add some yeast if there aren't enough natural yeast in the air. And you allow that to ferment for several days. And then it turns into this very carbonated drink called kvass. And it's very refreshing. Another iconic Russian food is blini. So if we think about the little cocktail blini, they're served at cocktail parties, which are about, 2 inches round. Russian blini are more like 4 inches. They can be made with buckwheat flour, which has no gluten. My favorites are probably like these, which is half buckwheat and half wheat flour. It gives a slightly more delicate taste. But true blini are made with yeast. And so you see all the wonderful pores in them, which allow the blini to soak up tons of butter. They're one of the earliest Russian foods. They were made in pagan times to celebrate the spring solstice, when the sun returned after a very long and cold winter. And they were baked on hot stones in the image of the sun. When Russia accepted Christianity in 988, they sort of incorporated the blini into the Christmas calendar, the Christian calendar, and they became the most important food that is served during Maslenitsa, which is the week-long butter festival that precedes Lent. So if in the United States we have Mardi Gras, which is Fat Tuesday, or Shrove Tuesday in the UK, The Russians celebrate with blini and butter for an entire week before the long Lenten fast. The thing that really defines Russian cuisine, or traditional Russian cuisine, as opposed to just Russian food, is the Great Russian Masonry Stove, which developed around the 16th century. It was heated with wood, and unlike, say, cultures like in China, where stir frying was developed, or in India, where the fuel was water buffalo dung, Russia had vast resources of timber, so they could use wood, in a very profligate way. These ovens take a lot of wood, but when they're first fired, they're really hot. So think about a pizza oven. And when they're really hot, that's when you put in the bread, or the wonderful pirashki, which are the small pies that the Russians love so much. The temperature would gradually start to fall if they didn't keep feeding the fire. And then you could put in things like soups, and if anyone had meat, which wasn't always a given, they could be slow cooked. And they were cooked in, I'll try moving the cursor without moving the slide, these either earthenware or cast iron casseroles. And so the flavor was really, really wonderfully mellowed. As the temperature continued to drop, you could start culturing dairy products, such as prostokvasha, which is like yogurt, or making sour cream, or tvarog, which is the farmer's cheese. And then finally, you could use it for drying herbs and things like that. Up here, this curtain is covering a platform which always remained warm, and that's where the old people like to lie, if they're aching arthritic backs. And the grandchildren would clamber up there. I once gave a talk at MIT to a group of engineers. Barbara Wheaton, if you know her work in culinary history, had decided that these engineers, they had a program called Counterculture, and she wanted them to understand what actually happened in the kitchen historically, so that it wasn't just all about electronics and tech. So she invited me to talk about the Russian stove, and I explained its wonderful properties and how it wasn't just a technique for cooking, but it was called the mat. It was the mother. And it took up a quarter to a third of a typical peasant cottage. It delineated the women's domain as opposed to the men's. In some parts of Russia, it was the only hygienic place in the, dirt-floored cottage. And so women would actually crawl into the stove, not while it was lit, obviously, but to give birth because it was hygienic. So I'm giving this lecture, and the students are all madly taking notes, and I was feeling great. Wow, they're so fascinated by my talk. And I finished, and at the end, I asked, are there any questions? And all these hands went up, and they had all been drawing diagrams of how to make the stove more efficient because it used too much fuel. And that was just an awful moment, because I felt I had failed to communicate the cultural importance of the stove. So I'm now moving ahead to the early 19th century, and I hope this didn't skip. Oh, it didn't. This is a painting by a wonderful artist named Alexei Venetsianov called Harvest. And what I want you to notice here is that Harvest is backbreaking, excruciating work. But this is an idealized picture of the Russian peasant. And right around now, in the late 1820s, 1830s, there came to be a big rift in Russian society between the Slavophiles, who were looking back to the time before Peter the Great introduced so many Western methods and ideas, and the Westernizers, who felt that Russia's future lay in an alliance with the West and an embrace of progressive Russian ideas. So this couldn't be a more pure depiction of Russia and the motherland. She is Madonna-like in her posture with her infant, taking a break from the very rigorous harvest. She has a sickle by her side. She's dressed in red, which is the color of beautiful in Russia. I always used to think the Red Square was because the Reds were the commies. I was a child of the 50s. But in fact, krasny, the word red, used to mean beautiful. So the original meaning of Red Square was beautiful square. And then a different word, krasivy, developed for beautiful. One thing that is also worth noticing or thinking about is that in the United States, who do we look back to as sort of our founding figures? It might be Uncle Sam or the founding fathers, but in Russia, it's definitely the feminine figure, the motherland. The motherland is opposed to the fatherland. And Tolstoy so celebrated the peasants and peasant life that he cosplayed being a peasant in his later years, partly to make up for his very bad ways when he was a young profligate count, doing all kinds of immoral things. And he became vegetarian in his old age and liked to work with his hand-pushed plows along with his horses, even though he could have afforded all kinds of help. So I want to show you just a few more deeply Russian foods. Foremost among them, at least for me, are the wonderful, wonderful berries that grow in the Russian fields and forests. There are whortleberries and blackberries and raspberries and bilberries and lingonberries and cloudberries and cranberries and on, and they're really, really wonderful. This is my friend Sasha, and he just had a great harvest of mushrooms. And it reminded me of this passage in Nabokov's Speak Memory. Mushrooms are so important to Russians, and I think this really captures the Russian feel for nature, the outdoors, but particularly mushrooms. One of his mother's, one of her greatest pleasures in summer was the very Russian sport of ходить по грибы, looking for mushrooms. Fried in butter and thickened with sour cream, her delicious finds appeared regularly on the dinner table. Not that the gustatory moment mattered much. Her main delight was in the quest. Rainy weather would bring out these beautiful plants in profusion under the firs, birches, and aspens in our park. Its shady recesses would then harbor that special boletic reek which makes the Russian's nostrils dilate, a dark, dank, satisfying blend of damp moss, rich earth, rotting leaves. And I just love it because, damp, dank, rot, those are sort of negatively charged words in English, but for Russian, they're, it means mushrooms are nearby. Honey is really important in Russian cuisine. Obviously, before sugar beet refineries were introduced in the 19th century, sugar was extremely expensive, and honey was really abundant in the wild forests of the Russian taiga in the north. And there are these stories of men going into the wild hives that they found in the forests, and one man falling in and almost drowning because there were great pools of honey. And the only way he survived was because a bear came along wanting the honey. And when the bear reached in, the man grabbed onto him and then started shouting, and the bear, in fright, pulled him out. That's legendary, of course, but honey and beeswax were some of Russia's most important exports. And John Tradescant the Elder, who's a very important English horticulturist and whose collection formed the basis for the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, he visited the northern city of Arkhangelsk in the 17th century and said that Russian honey was the best in the world. And of course, there's caviar, which can be the food of czars when served with champagne, or the food of more plebeian citizens when drunk with vodka. Very sadly, the Caspian sturgeon, which has existed truly since prehistoric times, is severely endangered, and very few of them remain. I won't eat Caspian sturgeon any longer. I mean, it's the very least I can do, but there's a lot of poaching. There are a lot of criminal activities surrounding it, and it's not really monitored. But there's also sturgeon roe, there's whitefish roe. I mean, not sturgeon, salmon roe, whitefish roe, trout roe, other kinds of roe that are enjoyed by Russians. When we talk about Russian food, we also have to talk about Russian hospitality. And this is the traditional sign of Russian hospitality, which is bread and salt. The Russian word for hospitality is chlebosolstvo, which means bread and saltness. And the idea being that bread is the staff of life and salt is the luxury, because salt was very expensive to produce. The Russians didn't have any mined salt until the Stroganov family in the 16th century under Ivan the Terrible made forays into Siberia, past the Ural Mountains, and started mining salt. So this is presented when people move into a new house, or if there's, any kind of opportunity to celebrate people, then a loaf of bread and salt is given. And for the coronation of Tsar Alexander III in 1883, you see that it, and again, I'm going to move my cursor very slowly right there. It features prominently on the coronation menu. And this is significant because all of the czars before him had had French menus, and everything was very much French style. And here, not only do you have the bread and salt, but up here, you have a gusli player. The gusli is a bit like a zither, that's a very Russian thing. And the menu is in Russian, and it has like a beet consommé, a soup called pashlyupka, which is like a vegetable soup, pirashki, it has sterlet, it has guryev kasha, which is semolina pudding, and just a very Russian menu. One of the, to me, more disturbing aspects of Russian hospitality is how extreme it once was. There was a German ambassador named Olearius who visited Russia in the 17th century, and he described the kissing ritual. And in the center, the figure in the green is a foreign visitor. And the way that the Russian nobility extended hospitality to their most esteemed guests was that after the meal, they would bring their wives out of seclusion in what was called the tserem, sort of like a harem where women were not supposed to be seen. They would force them to come down and offer a goblet of brandy to the visitor, and then the visitor was allowed to kiss them on their lips. You can see that the women don't look too thrilled about that. So Peter the Great changed everything. He was really cruel and destructive, but he did bring Russia into more modern times. He brought the women out of this tserem that I mentioned. He made them sit at the table with men. He made them wear décolletage, as French women were doing. He introduced the Dutch cooktop as opposed to the Great Russian stove, which enabled people who, at least those who were able to afford meat, to cook things more quickly and introduce the art of butchering so that you had things like scallops and steaks that could be cooked quickly instead of having to roast an entire joint in the Great Russian stove. The vocabulary of Russian changed over the course of the 18th century thanks to his introductions. And by the end of the century, one of the great playwrights, Alexander Sumarokov, wrote this treatise in which he was saying that it's one thing to use foreign words for foods that don't grow in Russia, but you should not use them for foods that we have. They're destroying our language. He was very upset that the word pashlyopka that I just mentioned, which is a kind of soup, people started using the word soup. And there were many other Latinized terms. A man named Vasily Lyovshin was well known for the fairy tales, the Russian fairy tales that he published in 1780. And then in 1816, he published a book called The Russian Kitchen, which you see on the right. And he gives recipes, and I have highlighted here, for real Russian foods. And the real Russian foods is important because it's not the European ones that had been introduced. And this was especially important in the wake of increased nationalism following the defeat of Napoleon in 1812. So if you can picture French banquets and sort of the French model, which was the classical model for the aristocracy throughout Western Europe, you see here in a diagram from Vincent Lachapelle's book, Le Cuisinier Moderne from 1735, and then a reconstruction of it done in Stockholm in 2014. All the foods for a banquet were set out on the table in a very geometric display. You had the central roast in the middle. You had soups in tureens. You had different salads around here. And then all of these little dishes on the edges were the hors d'oeuvres outside the main work, in effect. And that's why they were called hors d'oeuvres. And if you finished the soup, then you immediately removed it from the table and brought in the relevé, which was replacing it so that you would not destroy the geometry of the table. As you can see from the reconstruction, the food would sit out. You walk into the banquet hall, it's this wonderful feast for the eyes. But can you imagine all the bacteria that was growing and the food was getting cold? The Russian style of service was completely different. It was predicated on a bare table for which only salt, pepper, and vinegar were on the table. That changed a bit over the years, But the idea of the Russian table was that the courses were brought out sequentially rather than all being on the table at once, resulting in what came to be known as the dîner à la Russe. And this is spread from Mrs. Beaton's book of household management, published in London. This is the 1904 edition, showing an extravagant table set à la Russe. What you'll notice, though, is that except for these little bread rolls, which there's my cursor, are set into the napkins, there is no food on the table. You have candelabras, you have flowers, but the food, because historically in Russian you had a million serfs, each dish was paraded around the table by the serfs like a whole swan or a whole sturgeon. And then it was brought back to the kitchen and plated. It was still hot, and then it was individually served in individual portions. You can see how many pieces of utensils are on the table. And if you have all these people who are your slaves, basically, you can afford to do this. Dining Russian style became so popular in Europe. It was introduced there in around 1810, probably by Count Nesselrode, who was the Russian ambassador to Paris. Charles Dickens introduced it to London in the 1920s. It was introduced to the United States, to New York, by the late 1840s, and it was absolutely the rage. And today, if you take one thing away from this talk, it would be that the way we eat today, our standard, appetizer, soup, entree, and dessert, comes directly from the medieval Russian way of eating, where first there was the zakuska course, the appetizer course, then the soup, then the main course, and then the dessert, and the table was cleared entirely in between. Of course, that's the aristocracy, and for the peasants, it couldn't have been more different. They basically had little more than bread, a shared loaf, and soup, which they ate out of a communal pot. I think you can see the spoons here. Here's a spoon, here's a spoon. You can't quite see the pot, but they're all eating from the same pot. And their lives were pretty bad. One of the reasons, hunger, that led to the revolution in 1917. So now we're in the 20th century. And everything changed. The Tsar was overthrown. And instead of this idea of gastro-nationalism being a kind of opposition between Slavophile loving Russian foods and Westernizers admitting French foods and foreign foods into Russian cuisine, it became more politicized. And it was the difference between what was traditionally Russian and what was now Soviet, because after the revolution, Russia was no more, it was the Soviet Union. And the idea was to completely overthrow the old ways, to get rid of bourgeois life, to liberate women from the horrible work in the kitchen where you were literally buried under the samovar for making tea and all of the kitchen duties you have. And instead, the new Soviet women will lift you up. And March 8th, Women's, International Women's Day, is the day, this poster says, of women workers revolt against kitchen servitude, down with the oppression and Philistinism of household work. But what was the reality? Women were encouraged to leave the nuclear household and go to work. They were liberated, so to say, but they were sent to work in these enormous factory kitchens. And these factory kitchens could prepare meals for up to 1,000 workers a meal. And so women suddenly found themselves laboring in these big industrial kitchens where they had to haul enormous pots instead of a pot for just their nuclear family. And it was really backbreaking work. And then, of course, they'd have to go home and still pull something together for the family. Alexander Rodchenko, who's one of the great photographers and artists of the Soviet period, designed this factory kitchen. Just as in the 18th century, Sumarokov had ranted against all the foreign words in Russian being introduced under Peter the Great. So in Soviet times, this is from 1928, all of the handbooks and the guidelines that were sent out to the all of the cafeterias throughout the Soviet Union, which were standardized, they had to get rid of the old nomenclature. So anything that smacked of being foreign or bourgeois was changed. So you have this lovely crème du Barry, which even if you didn't know who du Barry was, it kind of has I don't know, it's evocative. It makes you think of something elegant. Cream of cauliflower soup, well, okay. But if you take bechamel and you make it thick white milk sauce, it's really unappetizing. Hollandaise, because you can't talk about Holland, it becomes white egg sauce and on and on and on. So that was really kind of a sad thing. But a lot of the iconography of the early Soviet period was exciting. So this is a poster from 1924 for the new sugar cooperative. And I don't know in your studies of culinary history whether you have looked at how sugar was sold, in the 18th and early 19th century. Even in the United States, it was wrapped it was made in cones, and it was wrapped in blue wax paper. And then you got it home and you had hammers and you broke it. And then, you had to basically refine it and process it yourself at home to get it granulated. So this is for a sugar refinery that welcomes in the new dawn, but it's also very militaristic, a little bit scary. Mayakovsky, the great poet of the revolution, he got into the act too. And so little kids could buy these Red Army Star candies that had ditties by Mayakovsky and drawings by him as well that told stories of the Russian Civil War, which took place between 1917 and 1922 after the revolution. So you were literally eating the propaganda. And that happened with ice cream too, which took the Soviet Union by storm when the first factory opened in 1937. Obviously, people had had ice cream before then, but it was not available to the masses. And the Minister of Trade, Anastas Mikoyan, had come to the United States in 1936 and toured ice cream and hamburger factories. And he brought both technologies back to the Soviet Union. The hamburger didn't really work, but the ice cream did. And he vowed that, in this competition, that the Soviet Union would come out ahead of the United States, and that every Soviet citizen was bound to eat no less than 5 kilos of ice cream a year. I hate to say that Americans undoubtedly eat a lot more than 5 kilos of ice cream a year. But Russian ice cream is really wonderful, and it was touted as nutritious. And here you see a little girl wearing a young pioneer garb. She's like a future Komsomol, a future communist. And so she, by eating ice cream, is being very patriotic. The big enemy became bourgeois and capitalist life in the United States. A poster from 1926 showing that Americans have abundance only for the rich, but we strive for abundance for all. And of course, this is at a time when Stalin was just beginning to consolidate power, which he did in 1928 by his collectivization, under which all of the independent and prosperous peasants, particularly in Ukraine, which had forcibly become part of the Soviet Union, were forced to become part of kolkhozes or collective farms. And they were exhorted, kolkhoz workers, from watermelon farms, gardens, and kitchen gardens, prepare a rich harvest for the people. But the reality of collectivization was the Holodomor, the great Ukrainian famine of 1932-1933, where food was, I don't really even have the words for it. Food was basically stolen from all of the peasants. The ones who were considered too wealthy, namely if they had a cow or if they had a single worker, they were exiled to Siberia or sent to the Gulag. Those at home who were still trying to eke out a living, their grain was requisitioned. It was stockpiled and guarded so that no one could eat it, and it just rotted. Young communist activists went from house to house to root out the last bit of grain. And between 5 and 10 million people died. They don't really know how many, and it was truly horrible. And of course, agriculture was ruined really for the rest of the Soviet period. In 1939, Mikoyan, who was the one who'd come to the United States, and Stalin published what became the Soviet culinary Bible, like Joy of Cooking, I guess you could say, the book of tasty and healthy food. And until 1997, it was regularly republished. And it really wasn't so useful for most people because it was so aspirational. It's a wonderful book to find out about the industrialization of agriculture and how the seafood industry was industrialized and all these different kinds of canned fish that you could get and all the nutritional aspects of food. But the reality was that there just wasn't much food in the stores. But the party line had it that the Soviet Union, which now comprised 15 different republics, was a union, it was a brotherhood. And all of the different countries that ranged from the Pacific Ocean to the Baltic Sea and down to the Caucasus were friendly. And in 1954, in Moscow, this Friendship of Peoples fountain was built, who's showing all women from all of the different republics. But the trope of this fountain is abundance. So in the center, you can see the sheaves of wheat, and you can see the sunflowers, and, you know, the whole idea being fertility of the women and of the land. In 1978, a man named Pashyopkin, which is an interesting last name because it comes from the word for Russian soup, published this cookbook, The National Cuisines of Our Peoples, again touting, this one big happy family in the Soviet Union. But it was really kind of an imperialistic project. It started out with Russian cooking that you see at the top. That was first. And after Russian came the other Slavic ones. So then there was Ukrainian, and then there was Belarusian. All of these were celebrated as really wonderful cuisines. And then came the foods of the other republics, and many of those foods, like Uzbek plov, which is a rice pilaf, or Georgian chicken tabaka, which is a flattened and pressed chicken, were appropriated into Russian cuisine. At the very end of the book, the last chapter was titled Subarctic Mongolian Jewish Cuisines. And the picture for the chapter opener shows the subarctic and the Mongolian, but significantly, it does not show Jewish. Because, basically the Soviet Union and Russia before it were very anti-Semitic, and they only gave these three cuisines, a few pages and had very derogatory things to say about them. So this is the Soviet Union I knew when I started going there as a student. The bread lines. You could wait for hours in line to get bread, but I have to say it was always fresh and it was always good. And people managed because they had connections, they had systems of bartering. They learned to exchange things with people. They would find out when a shipment of something had suddenly appeared, like bananas, and then everyone would go stand in line for hours and get them. But it was a pretty hard life. And the Russians had a certain trouble with their identity. This is a postcard from the late 1960s, like it's a Happy New Year card, which is the same as a Christmas card here. Like, who are we? Are we traditional Russians with our hospitality of bread and salt? Or are we Soviets coming from the future, having conquered space? And there was this tension throughout. So looking to Russia, looking to the West, was it Russian values? Was it Western values? It kind of culminated in 1991 in January when the first McDonald's opened in Moscow, literally steps from Red Square. So it was a very, in your face kind of opening. And here, if I can move this cursor, you can see under McDonald's the hammer and sickle of the Soviet flag. 30,000 people showed up on the first day for 900 seats. And it was just a phenomenon. They'd never experienced service with a smile or consistency. Voice of America interviewed one man who managed to get in. He said, I felt as though we were taking a bite of America itself. It was just thrilling. And McDonald's actually did some good things, much as we might not like McDonald's, but it introduced this idea of serving people pleasantly. It had clean bathrooms. The food on the menu was always available. And whereas in the beginning, 80% of the food used in McDonald's was had to be farmed by the McDonald's Corporation. By 2020, 98% of the food was in Russian hands and had been turned over to the local economy. So it did a good thing in terms of food systems. Of course, in 2022, McDonald's pulled out because of the invasion of Ukraine. This Russian artist, Alexander Kosolapov, had a lot of fun with the collision of ideologies, the capitalist and the communist. And after the Soviet Union collapsed in December of 1991, it was total chaos in the 1990s, and it was really disastrous for most of the Russian people because a lot of Russia's wealth had been distributed to these oligarchs. The people were starving again. They didn't have the safety net they once did. But there were some new entrepreneurs who tried to bring Russian-style fast food to Russia. And this was fairly short-lived. It was only 10 years. Enterprise called Blin Donald's. And obviously it served blini. But what I wanted to point out here is under the Donald's, if I can. So here's Blin Donald's instead of McDonald's. This says real Russian, and the Russian is in larger font, fast food. So again, we're Russian. And Tsirimok is still going strong today. And in fact, until a few years ago, there was a branch of it on 7th Avenue in New York City. And the idea being that Russians, we too can have fast food. It doesn't have to be foreign. And the breakup of the Soviet Union led to some interesting things. Starbucks came in 2022. It left again because of the Ukraine invasion, but a new Russian coffee shop, which is not good at all, came in. I don't think anyone was trying to sue for copyright logo violation, but they slightly modified the Starbucks logo to take advantage of the traditional Russian headgear known as the kokoshnik and the Russian Army red hat. In 2009, this guy named Boris Akimov founded a shop and a cafe in Moscow called Lavka Lavka, which means shop shop. And for a few years in the early 2010s, or the early 2000s and into the 2010s, before the invasion of Crimea, it was kind of a wonderful time for Russian cuisine because he was really interested in real Russian food, the pishcha, not the yeda. And so he went about trying to get farmers to start growing these foods that had pretty much disappeared in the 70 odd years of Soviet rule. And he connected farmers and consumers. He started a shop. The cafe, he started serving old Russian foods that had pretty much been lost. And he did a lot of really wonderful things. I don't know if any of you saw Andrei Zvyagintsev film Leviathan from 2014, but it showed in the Arctic, this town called Teribirka, how when the fishing industry collapsed after the Soviet Union fell apart, everyone just turned to drink and it was corruption. And Boris Akimov was really upset by that. So he started this New Life Festival in this small town in the Arctic, which I did visit, to show that there were good things that were happening there too. And they served tea out of samovars. And they served sea urchins from the Barents Sea, which are incredibly wonderful, and Kamchatka crab, and all of these wonderful dishes, and trying to show that there was a lot of good in Russian life. Well, I'm getting to the end now. So after Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, all these sanctions were placed on Russia. And in response, Russia placed sanctions on the import of foods from the US, Canada, the EU, Australia, and New Zealand. Nevertheless, a lot of foods came through, and when they did, and when they were discovered, this is showing a bulldozer destroying the food in Smolensk, which is on the border of Belarus, and just destroying the food. A lot of people were tremendously upset at this waste. They felt it could have gone to hospitals, to charities, to orphanages, and instead the food was just destroyed. This organization called Eat Russian arose, which was very nationalistic. And they got journalists, they were very media savvy, and invited the journalists to come with them into stores to show how many foreign foods were still in the stores. And they put little stickers on the foods that had a Russian bear growling or roaring at an American flag. And the idea was that you were supposed to eat Russian only. One of the good things that came out of this is that the Russians, who had never learned to make aged cheese, they were only eating fresh cottage cheese like preparations. They really missed the cheese that had come in after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they learned to make their own feta, their own blue cheese, their own brie, their own cheddar. And the cheeses are fabulous. So it really inspired creativity and innovation. But at the same time, there's this ugly undercurrent of nationalism. People who were trying to tout Russian food would say things like, look at what's on our tables. We raise artificially raised foreign sea bass, Dorado, Norwegian salmon. Yet we have our own fish from the Black Sea, the Sea of Azov, the Baltic Sea, Lake Baikal, and a multitude of rivers and lakes. We have delicacies like muksun, which is a whitefish, and omu, which lives in Baikal. And they were really saying that anything made in Russia or harvested in Russia is intrinsically better. And in 2015, there was even a bill proposed to the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, to force restaurants that were of foreign cuisine to serve 50% Russian foods. Because again, the abundance of restaurants with European cuisine and American fast food adversely affects the prestige of the country. Luckily, that bill did not pass. Other kind of scary iterations. This is a chocolate bar showing a map of Russia in 2016. The red hatch marks are, well, the pictures are the existing territory of Russia. The blue stripes here, that is the new territories, that is Crimea. And all of the red hash marks are prospective territories. So it's highly scary and imperialistic. This extended as well to a vodka that was introduced for export in 2013 that was called Valinki. Valinki are the traditional felt boots worn by Russians. And it was touted as being deeply Russian, the real Russian soul, as you can see here. And if you drink this vodka, then you are partaking of everything that is deeply Russian and preserving Russian traditions. But in 2015, they introduced the one on the right with this new patriotic neck hanger, which, went on the neck of the bottle, that says, "We were in Paris, we went to Berlin, and we will be in New York." So Paris, that was the Napoleonic Wars. Berlin, that was World War II. New York, yet to come. So, I mean, it's really kind of scary if you take it all very seriously. This is what Russian supermarkets looked like immediately after the invasion of Ukraine. They were empty. But Russians found a way to, get around a lot of the sanctions. In the meantime, UNESCO declared borscht part of the intangible cultural heritage of Ukraine, affirming that it's a Ukrainian food, not a Russian one. And the Russian Foreign Ministry responded by saying, "Our borscht doesn't need to be defended and is subject to immediate and complete destruction in the bowl." So all of this is really upsetting. So I want to end with this slide. of Russian bread. This is by a photographer named Donald Weber, and what he's showing here is actually the 3-month ration of Russian rye bread that was given to inmates, prisoners in the Gulag. So Russian bread, the real sourdough stuff, is both sustenance and also sacrament. I see it here almost on this breadboard as in the shape of the cross. And it really goes to the heart of what Russian cuisine is all about. And I realize I've gone a few minutes over, so I will stop here. I have a few more slides that could talk about fermentation, but I really feel like I've gone long enough. So it's up to you.
Myself would be more than happy to hear your discussion of fermentation. I suspect that would be the general sense of the group. So if you don't mind, go ahead. And in the meantime, for those of you who have questions, if you want to put them in the chat, and Darra wants to spend yet more time answering questions after she's done telling us about fermentation, we can take your questions off of the chat.
Okay, so I'll try not to be long-winded. I had, over a century of Russian history to get through. Black salt. I don't know if you know this. This isn't specifically fermentation, but kind of. So if you have, I mentioned that when you're making kvass, you take Russian rye bread and you soak it overnight, and then you press the bread to extract the flavor from it, and you add honey to the water and you let that ferment into the kvass. So to make this salt, you take that mash, or you can start with just a loaf of dry, stale Russian bread, and you don't have to start with the mash, and you soak it. But this time you want to save the mash or the bread. And you take it and you get a little bit of the moisture out, but you still want it to be wet. And you put it into a cast iron pan, and then you bake it at 500 degrees until it is completely charred. It makes a hard charred disc. It takes about half an hour, and you have to be really careful when you take it out of the oven because, what I do is I open the front door, and then I have a pot holder. I open the oven and I quickly run to the front door with smoke trailing me, hoping the fire alarm won't go off, the smoke alarm won't go off. And then once it's cooled, you break it up and you have black salt. And the black salt was traditionally made on the Thursday before Easter to purify the house. It was done in the Great Russian Stove. And then because it has all these nutritive properties, sometimes oats could be added or herbs could be added. It was used medicinally over the course of the year. So it's both for purification and for health. Russian dairy, I didn't really talk about except to mention that Russians had never mastered the art of aging cheese. What they do beautifully is farmer's cheese, tvarog, which is basically cottage cheese, except it's a lot drier. You allow the whey to drain off. So all of these things start with raw milk. We're lucky enough because we live in the country. I have a source of raw milk. But if you're afraid of using raw milk, which is understandable, you can always just take homogenized milk as long as it's from a good dairy and hasn't been ultra pasteurized, and add a little bit of kefir to it, and that will start the souring process. And then you can let that milk that you've added the kefir to sit overnight, and it will curdle. and then you drain it for 3 or 4 hours, and you're left with this beautiful, tangy farmer's cheese that can be eaten just out of hand, or it's used a lot in baking. You can fill tarts with it. The Russian Easter is today, as a matter of fact. And it is put into a press and sweetened, and something like a dozen egg yolks are added to it. So it's really rich. And then it's put into a mold and allowed to drain for 24 hours until the mold is solid. And then you can slice it and eat it on the Russian Easter bread called Pascha. You can make cultured butter from sour cream. And again, you can make your own sour cream by taking unpasteurized cream. You can start with the milk, allow the cream to separate from the milk, or you can just get really fresh, unpasteurized or not ultra pasteurized cream. Let it sour overnight and become sour cream. And then you can whip that cream. I would not recommend doing it by hand, but do it in the KitchenAid or in a butter churn if you have one. And then you have cultured butter. And it's really wonderful, spread on lacto-fermented black bread. And if you want a little bit of zing to it, you can add some whitefish roe that has been salted. And then one of my very favorite Russian treats is called ryazhenka, and that's made in Ukraine as well. And what you do for that is you take milk and you pour it into a shallow pan, like a 9 by 13 inch pan, and you bake it very slowly at around 300 degrees. And after a couple hours, you open the oven and you'll see that a skin has formed on it, and you stir the skin into the milk. And then for the next 4 or 5 hours or 6, depending on how quickly the process goes, every hour you open the oven, you stir the skin into the milk until you have a very thick caramelized milk with a pretty thick skin on top. And then you take that skin with a skimmer and you carefully lift it off and set it aside. And if you remember, I mentioned that for the coronation of Tsar Alexander III, Guriev kasha was on the menu, and I said it was a semolina pudding. So semolina is basically cream of wheat. And it was layered with skins from this baked milk in between the layers, and then brandied fruit was put in between the layers, and then it was served almost like a trifle. So once you have this baked milk, then you mix in a little bit of yogurt that has a live culture in it, and you let it sit overnight to ferment and culture, and it gets nice and thick. And then you chill it for, say 6 hours in the refrigerator, and you have this unbelievably creamy caramelized pudding that has probiotics since you fermented it. And then you can take the skin and tear it up and put it on top. And so those are just a few of the Russian dairy products that are so wonderful. And then one more slide, and that is pickling. So I think for most Americans, when you think about pickles, they are vinegar pickles. And certainly Russians will eat pickles that have been preserved in vinegar, but that is not the Russian way. They really need to be lacto-fermented, which simply means taking the fresh cucumbers or cabbage or other vegetables and soaking them in a brine for if you want half sour pickles, a salt brine. If you want half sour pickles, it only takes about 3 days. If you want full sours, it can take about 5 days until they're fully sour. The brine can range between 3.5% salt to 5%, depending on how firm and how salty you like your pickles. One thing I like to do, and this will be in the cookbook that is coming out in the fall, is an old Russian method is to pickle the cucumbers in a pumpkin. And what's great about that is the pumpkin lends this sort of indescribable pumpkin flavor that's very subtle to the pickles. And what the Russians would do would be to take the whole pumpkin and put it in an enormous barrel, which they would have in their root cellars. And they would surround the pumpkin with more pickles just floating in the brine. I don't bother to do that. But the leaves you see here are from horseradish and from black currant because they have lots of tannins in them. So if you add them to the brine, along with dill and garlic and peppercorns, I like to add a little bit of clove and allspice, then the pickles will be more firm. If you don't have access to fresh horseradish leaves or fresh currant leaves, you can add a couple of oak leaves. Just, be sure to wash them, especially if you're living in the city, wash them very carefully so they don't have any kind of pollutants on them. And those are really good pickles. One thing that is distinctive to Russian fermentation is a process called machinia, which means something more like moistening as opposed to brining. It also uses a salt brine, but it's a light one, never more than 3 to 3.5%. And it's used with fruits primarily, and tomatoes actually are fruits. And I should have put a picture of watermelon here because brined, I'm calling it brine because moistened just doesn't sound right in English, but brine watermelon is my absolute favorite. But what you do is you soak the tomatoes or the watermelon in this brine again for only about 3 days. And you add a little bit of sugar to it too, and you can add seasonings like dill and, of course, garlic. And it has the most wonderful fresh flavor. So, whereas in the American South, you think of watermelon rind pickles, it uses the rind, but it doesn't use the flesh. In Russia, it's not the rind, it's the flesh that you're after. And so you start with, you don't want a super ripe watermelon because it'll get mushy, but one that is ever so slightly underripe, and it's fabulous. And then the apples. The Russians love these sour apples. They're called Antonovka. People have written short stories about them. They're so beloved. And for these, they're soaked in the brine for, about 5 days, again, with these flavorings. And then they're allowed to age for 3 to 4 months before they're served. They remain crisp, but inside they turn kind of, I want to say golden because brown doesn't sound very nice, but it's sort of a winey effect. They taste like they have turned into apple wine in a way, and they're really wonderful to serve on a cheese board. So that is a distinctively Russian way of preserving fruits and particularly berries. And on his deathbed, it was recorded that the great Russian national poet Alexander Pushkin, his last words were, "Give me brined cloudberries." So I guess he went off to heaven or wherever feeling happy because he got his last bite of berries. So that is it. And I will stop my share now, take a sip of water, and then if there are any questions, I'm happy to, I'm just gonna do
Uh,
this.
If you've got questions, folks, you can put them in the chat, or if we don't happen to see them there and you want to indicate.
Yeah, I
um,
see there are 7 there, but Bruce, I'm gonna let you handle them.
Okay. Um, let's see, the first one is from Elisabetta, and she is asking, saying she would like to ask you about dried cod in Russia. She's asked for your contact information. Um, and you mentioned the Varangians from Sweden.
Yeah.
The question there, did they bring or eat dried cod? What about codfish liver?
Oh, well, what an interesting question. I'm of the generation that cod liver oil was something that children were supposed to have when they were little, to get the omega-3s. And it was really disgusting. And I always thought that cod liver was horrible. But when I was in the Arctic, researching my Russian cookbook, Beyond the North Wind, I went to a number of new Russian restaurants. And this was in 2017 when I was doing the research. It was before the worst of the things happened with Russia. And they were doing extraordinary dishes with cod liver, little pies with cod liver, and, the way we would eat foie gras. And it was absolutely delicious. So Russians have been using cod liver as a delicacy in pies and in other ways for a very long time. They've also been drying cod and other fish. The salt air, as you know, in Norway, there was a big industry of making stockfish, which is, a kind of dried cod. They also did that in Russia as well. But that was pretty much just in the far north. In the south of Russia, on the Don River, they would take the little Don River fish and dry those. They're very, very, they would salt them and dry them and eat them as a beer snack. They were not eviscerated and they're pretty intense. But yeah, drying is a part of the cuisine.
Okay, we have several comments that were just compliments on the presentation
Thank you.
from Susan Lagan, Judy Mazza, Elizabeth again, and Kathleen Fitzgerald. I will add my own. I didn't put it into the chat. It was a very interesting presentation. And one last question, Judy Mazza says, when we were in Russia outside of St. Petersburg, I asked to go to a supermarket, which was well stocked. I wanted to take a photo of some hanging sausages, and it was forbidden. Do you know why?
Yes, if you can tell me what year you were there, roughly.
I'm trying to remember now, probably 2010 to 2012, somewhere in that range.
Oh, that's interesting.
I mean,
Um,
it was like a huge market, like almost like I want to say a Walmart or a Costco size place. It was
yeah.
giant. It was very, very well stocked. And I just wanted to walk around and I saw this pretty display of all these sausages hanging. I just want to take a photo, right? And they say, oh, no, 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 we can't do that.
Okay. Well, it was no longer Soviet times, but in Soviet times, any foreigner taking photographs was suspect. I mean, you were not allowed to take photographs of bridges, of railways, of all kinds of things. And
Right.
if you took pictures of people, they were often frightened. So it could have been just this generational suspicion of a foreigner taking photographs, or it could have been that this store was very proud of its displays and felt very proprietary and didn't want their displays broadcast on social media.
Well, it was kind of interesting. We were with private guides. We were there for on a cruise ship for a couple of days, and I had a whole list of, kind of food experiences I wanted. One was a supermarket, another was a farmer's market. No problem taking pictures at the farmer's market. I have a beautiful garlic photo that I will never forget from that trip. But and the guides that were with us were a lot younger than we were, but they still just didn't, they were the ones that prohibited me. It wasn't a store staff member or anything like that. It was just, you know, I just, I can still see them in my mind's eye, but I would have enjoyed the photo too. It's just interesting that, and maybe you're right. It's just a sort of a cultural hangover, if you will, from earlier times.
Yeah, that's all I can think of because sausages really, unless they were in the shape
So
of missiles, I don't know
no,
what to
it's
think.
nothing. They were totally benign. There was just a
Yeah.
nice bunch of them. It's nothing, nothing
Uh,
that special about them, frankly. Well, this was great
Interesting.
fun. This
oh,
was super fun. I
I,
want to go make some kasha varnishkas now. So
yeah, good idea. I saw a couple more. One, Cece had one, and then there was one
Yes.
about dumplings I didn't couldn't quite read.
Okay, I missed the fact that Cece had originally asked a question. It was hidden in the by the upper border of chat. She said, "My husband and I used to enjoy going to Brighton Beach in New York to enjoy all the Russian bakeries and pierogi shops. The last time we were there, the older Russian bakers seemed to have retired, and the food stores were replaced with fast food and junk food. Are the younger generations keeping up Russian food traditions, or are they falling by the wayside?"
Uh, it's a mix. Um, there are some, what comes to mind is this very talented pastry chef who is on Instagram as Dacha46. And her business with her partner is to make all of these Soviet extravagant multi-layered cakes. And she sells them. And she also does Russian feasts. So there's a coterie of young Russian uh, people who are keeping Russian traditions alive, but I think it is more through individual entrepreneurship and not so much through stores in Brighton Beach. Although I have to say that the big Uzbek supermarket just opened a year ago on 6th Avenue, in New York City, in Manhattan. So they have all kinds of Russian and Central Asian specialties. So those traditions are being kept alive. And we can segue into that question about dumplings from which I didn't see the end of the question.
Are there dumplings other than pierogies?
Oh, well, pierogies are not Russian. Pierogies are Polish. And the Russian dumplings, the Russian pies, I should say, are pierogi, which are the counterpart to the Polish pierogies. But the Russian dumplings are actually the Siberian dumplings known as pilmeni. And they come from the region of Perm, which is just beyond the Urals in the near part of Siberia. And they're shaped like little ears. And they're stuffed generally with a mix of beef and pork and onions. So those are the Russian dumplings that they've become part of Russian cuisine, but they're originally Siberian.
Okay. Let's see. I think that the next two that were just added are observations. Madeline Barris said in the 80s, when a coworker picked up Russian friends emigrating to the US, he would take them to a supermarket and they would cry.
I
I remember
know.
reading about that as well.
Yeah.
And Elizabetha adds, I was in Russia in 1979, Moscow and Leningrad, and was allowed to take lots of photos, had no problems before the US decided to pull back from the Olympic Games. And
Mm.
I can see why that would create a reaction.
Yeah, I mean, there were problems, but really it was limited to bridges, anything military, uh, anything that seemed sensitive. But yeah, you could definitely take pictures earlier.
And Audrey Hong has added a question. The early Russian cookbook had Mongolian dishes. Is there anything Mongolian in the cuisine today?
No, I mean, there's what do we think of as Mongolian, the hot pot? Um, it's interesting because Mongolia had friendly relations with Russia, but was never part of the Soviet Union. Mongolian foods were not incorporated into Russian cuisine, and I cannot think of a single Mongolian food that is in Russian cuisine. I mean, I could grab that cookbook and look at what he Pashyokin um, listed there. And it's interesting that he included it since Mongolia was not a Soviet republic, but it was like a friendly place. So I would have to go back and look at the cookbook to see what was there. Yes, my email. You can just Google me and I'll uh, come up through my website, which is darragoldstein.com, or else you can email me at Darra with 2 R's.Goldstein at williams.edu. It's easy to find me.
And then Cece had added a reminder. We mentioned Russ Ooze, the Russian Uzbekistan restaurant, which is in Arlington. And I think that's it for questions that are currently in the chat. And anybody have any others? I don't see any hands. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation.
That was so much fun. That was
Oh.
really
Really
great.
very, very informative and interested me very much in trying some more Russian food.
Well, good. That's the whole point, is not to cancel everything Russian despite all the terrible stuff that's happening. Thank you all for listening, and I appreciate the invitation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Indeed, as a matter of fact, one of the benefits of speaking to this group is that we will now put you on as a member for the next year. So
Oh, how
you'll
nice.
be getting our newsletter with information about other talks that are going on. We fairly frequently see a couple of other speakers showing up for subsequent talks. We hope that you will join us. And with
I
that,
will if I can. So thank you.
thanks again.
Okay.
That concludes the presentation part of our program. I've got a few little bit of business items for the group. Darra, you're more than welcome to stay if
Okay.
you want, but we
Yeah.
have kept you quite a bit longer than I think we asked you to speak.
Bye-bye.
Bye. I, I'd like to know if any of you have any announcements or want. I'll add what's it's to it because nobody seems to have one, so we'll just make it one combined presentation. But I have a couple of announcements that I'd like to get across to the group. The first one has to do with our next presentation. Please remember that unlike the rest of the year, this takes place on the first Sunday in May. That's May 3rd. Third? No. What is the first Sunday in May?
It's May 3rd, Bruce.
It is May 3rd. Okay. I'm not sure why all of a sudden that looked wrong. Anyway, it's May 3rd. The second thing is, if you have noticed, if you've started thinking about next year and you've looked at the CHoW line for April, or looked on the website, you will see that we have unfortunately had to increase the membership fee. This is the first time in 9 years that that's happened, but as these things go, even though we are not, it is not especially costly to run CHoW, we are having a declining membership and we don't seem to be able to do anything to get that reversed. So in order to make sure we got the revenue to cover the costs that we incur to put these programs on, we have had to increase the membership fee to is it $40 or $45?
45.
45. Those of you, if there are any of you on the call who get the printed CHoW line, you're going to see a substantial supplement in order to get a printed CHoW line. Clara Raju ran us down the cost of sending each issue for the 9 that we do. And so we determined that that is approximately $25 per person for an annual printed subscription to the newsletter. So the supplement for the newsletter in print will be $25 for a total of $70.
The post office just announced it's
Yeah.
raising its rates, so that might go up a little bit further to cover
We're
the
not
cost.
making any money on that.
Yeah.
Finally, just as a projection, we had mentioned that rather than a June presentation, we would have a luncheon, which is actually going to be at the end of May. Cece and Judy, have we progressed enough that we can provide any details on that, or should we just continue with a save the date?
I can talk about it.
Yeah, I think you
Um,
should.
It's a brunch on Sunday, May 31st at 11:30 at June. It's a Persian restaurant at Tyson's, and the chef owner is Najmiya Batmangli, who has spoken at our CHoW meeting a couple of years ago. She happens to be a friend of mine from about 30 years, and she's made a special menu for us. And I think CHoW is still determining the cost of it, but it should be a terrific brunch. And Najmi is going to come address our group about Persian cuisine history.
It's a
The
beautiful and
in the
outstanding
May,
restaurant. It's really, it's a great thing. So, the truth is that, last year we were able to do it for like $50. It's going to be a little bit more. Everything is unfortunately with inflation going up a few dollars here and a few dollars there. So we're doing what we can to keep the costs down,
and
but
there's
it is what it is.
free
You got your
valet
hand up.
parking.
Right.
That's what I was gonna say.
Yeah, free
Yeah.
valet parking. It's really
Free
very
valet
nice.
parking, yes.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, and we have some 30th anniversary CHoW items to give people who attend.
A special surprise.
A special surprise with a 30th anniversary CHoW logo on it. And the restaurant is rated by Washingtonian Magazine as number 35 of their 100 restaurants in the DMV. It's received all kinds of praise in the New York Times, and it's a lovely restaurant and great food. So hope you all can come. The
Easy.
invitation will be in the May newsletter.
Yeah.
Does anybody have anything else that they would like to announce or
No, be
ask
sure
or-
to pay your dues.
Yes, please be sure to pay your dues. I didn't mention, actually, there is one other aspect that you'll see about dues. Historically, one of the ways that the organization has acquired members is they visited a presentation, decided that it looked interesting enough, and the monthly and the annual fee is affordable enough that they would then join. We haven't really pursued that much since we've converted to Zoom. And so you'll see in the newsletter that there is, in addition to the base fee and the supplement for the fee is supplemented by a printed newsletter, there's also an opportunity for people to sign up and watch a single presentation so that they can get a sense of what this is about and whether the subject matters and the sorts of things that we cover look interesting enough that they want to join. The hope is that we'll collect a few more and maybe even level off the decline we've been seeing in membership. But I would ask each of you to try to think through your mental Rolodex. That's a telephone list for those of you who are too young to know what a Rolodex is. Go through the mental Rolodex and see if you've got any friends you might convince to get interested in culinary history and join our group. And with that, if nobody has anything else they'd like to add, we are concluded for today.
Thank you, Bruce.
Thank you.
I put Darra's email address in the chat if anybody wants it.
Okay.